By the time the world saw her standing in glitter and light, shouting, "What's love got to do with it?" into a roaring crowd. The most important part of Tina Turner's story had already been buried under decades of silence. Not in a vault, not in an archive, but inside hotel rooms where no one asked questions, dressing rooms where no one dared to knock, and contracts where her name appeared second, even when her voice carried everything. If you opened her life like a case file, it wouldn't start with superstardom. It would start with a road that cut through cotton fields in Nutbush, Tennessee. In the early 1940s, Anna Mae Bullock was a little girl running through dust, listening to the distant thud of church drums and the low talk of adults who never shared what truly worried them. She learned early that love could leave without warning. Her parents came and went, arguments erupted, hands were raised, and then there was absence. The first bruise was abandonment, not a fist. Years later, that same girl walked into a dark, sweating club in East St. Louis and met the man who would change everything. His name was Ike Turner. Inside the Club Manhattan, the air was so thick with cigarette smoke it looked almost solid. Glasses clinked, a jukebox whined between sets, and men in narrow ties leaned into women's ears, trading promises they never planned to keep. On stage, Ike Turner and the Kings of Rhythm were not just playing, they were controlling the room. Ike's hands moved across the guitar like he was cutting wire. Sharp, efficient, never wasting motion. His eyes were always scanning. The crowd, the band, the exits. He didn't just lead the music, he owned the space. Anna Mae watched him from the shadows at first, balancing on the edge of a chipped bar stool, feeling the vibrations of the band through her feet. She didn't know arrangements, publishing, or royalties yet. All she knew was that something in her chest matched the rhythm on stage. One night, when the microphone was left alone for just a moment too long, she moved. Not with a plan, just with instinct. She crossed the room, picked up that microphone, and sang. The sound that came out was not polite. It was raw, cracked at the edges, soaked in every abandonment, every empty room she had survived. It cut through the noise, turning conversations into silence, one by one. Musicians stopped mid-chord. Heads turned. Even the bartender froze with a bottle halfway tilted. Ike Turner looked up. He had spent years watching the music industry treat him like a ghost. He had played on Rocket 88, a record some historians later called the first rock and roll single, but the credit had slipped through his fingers. Other men's names went on the label. Other men got the headlines. Ike learned a cruel equation. Talent did not equal power. Control did. So when he heard that voice slice through the smoke in Club Manhattan, he didn't hear just a girl from Nutbush. He heard leverage. He brought her into the band, first as background, then as a feature, then as the center. He gave her a name that sounded sharp, electric, made for marquees: Tina, Ike, and Tina Turner. A single unit. His idea, his construct, his brand. To the outside world, it looked like a savior story. A young woman plucked from nowhere and given a stage, a band, a future. But inside the machinery, something else was being built. The rehearsals were relentless. Ike's temper lived in the small moments. A missed step, a late entrance, a harmony slightly out of place. His corrections were not really corrections. They were warnings. He would snap at band members, slam his hand on an amp, stare at Tina with a look that said more than words ever could. At first, the anger stayed inside the music. Then it didn't. The shift was almost invisible from the outside. A raised voice in a dressing room that no one wanted to overhear. A door closed a little too hard. A glass placed on a table with just enough force that everyone nearby went quiet. The band learned the signs, the way an animal learns weather. They knew when a storm was moving in. Managers, promoters, label men in suits saw something else. They saw hits. Ike and Tina Turner Review became a touring machine. Night after night, city after city, the same ritual. Cramped buses, cheap motels, half-slept mornings, blazing lights, and crowds who never suspected anything was wrong. Tina would step on stage with lashes heavy under the heat, legs burning from the constant dance routines, voice already rasped from overuse. The crowd heard power. They didn't hear exhaustion. Backstage, Ike controlled everything. He controlled the set list. He controlled the money. He controlled the travel, the band, the narrative. When contracts were put on tables, they were unfolded in front of Ike, not Tina. Her name was there, but the pen stayed in his hand. When executives spoke about their future, they addressed him first, then glanced at her like an accessory. The system liked the arrangement. One man to negotiate, one woman to perform. It kept everything tidy, efficient, containable. And in that structure, Ike's violence found cover. The first time he hit her, it did not happen under a spotlight. It happened in a private space where the only witnesses were four walls and a silence that would last for years. He struck her not as a stranger, but as someone who believed he owned the product the world was cheering for. He apologized afterward, the way many abusers do, with softness that felt borrowed from another life, with promises that sounded almost believable, with a logic that twisted harm into necessity. He was under pressure. The band depended on them. The label needed a hit. He needed her to be perfect. The cruelty hid behind the word need. The bigger Ike and Tina Turner became, the smaller Tina felt inside her own body. Outfits got shorter. Dances got wilder. The shows became a storm of motion, sweat, and sound. Reviewers called her a fireball, a hurricane, a force of nature. No one wrote about the bruises carefully placed where cameras couldn't see. Every night she walked a line no one in the audience knew existed, the line between survival and collapse. There were moments, small and cold, that stayed with her long after the applause faded. The sound of Ike's footsteps in a hotel corridor when everyone else was asleep. The clink of ice in a glass just before an argument turned into something worse. The way a band member would look down at his shoes when the tension in a room reached a pitch that felt like something inside her might break. She tried to leave more than once. The world only knows the night she finally ran, but there were earlier escapes, aborted in half whispers and bus schedules. Each time, the same forces pulled her back. Fear, children, money. The open threat that no one would book Tina Turner without Ike Turner attached to the contract. Industry power protected him. Silence protected him. Her loyalty, twisted and reshaped by years of psychological and physical abuse, protected him. On paper, they were a success story. Grammys, television specials, screaming crowds, marquee lights across America and Europe. In reality, Tina lived inside a tightening circle. Every hit record made it harder to walk away. Every magazine cover became another layer of armor around Ike's control. The myth of the perfect duo was not just profitable, it was a shield. By the late 1960 seconds, the cost of staying was no longer just physical pain, it was her mind. There came a night when hotel wallpaper seemed to tilt, when the noise inside her head grew louder than any audience. A night when she looked at the man sleeping beside her, at the life built around his rage, and decided that the only way out might be to disappear entirely. That was the moment the file stopped being a story of ambition and became a story of survival. The night Tina Turner decided the world might be better off without her was the night her legend truly began. But the world would not see that part. Not yet. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. The night Tina Turner decided the world might be better off without her did not happen on a stage, or in a headline city, or under cameras. It happened in a hotel room where the carpet was too clean, the lighting too soft, and the silence too loud. By the late 1960 seconds, the Ike and Tina Turner Review was a touring storm. They opened for the Rolling Stones, tore through Europe, set American television on fire. Reviewers called their performances explosive, unmatched, unforgettable. Every superlative the industry had to offer was attached to their name. But inside the marriage, the explosions were private and unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. On the road, Tina's days were measured in obligations. Wake up before the sun, even if she'd only slept a few hours. Fix her hair, stitch or tape costumes that had been ripped during the previous night's show. Rehearse choreography until the muscles in her legs trembled. Then step onto a bus or into a plane and move to the next city as if she were just another piece of equipment being transported. Ike's temper traveled with them. He had created the Review, and he never let anyone forget it. In rehearsals, he barked orders with the intensity of a drill sergeant. On stage, he controlled the band with sharp gestures, sudden glares, subtle nods that kept everyone on edge. In private, control didn't stop at the music. He dictated what Tina wore, how she spoke in interviews, who she could see, when she could rest. If she smiled too brightly at someone else, he noticed. If she expressed an opinion that disrupted his story, he noticed. If she hesitated before agreeing with him, he noticed. And the consequences always arrived. Sometimes as words that sliced into her confidence, sometimes as blows that turned parts of her skin into secret topographies of pain. The world saw quick costume changes. It did not see the extra layer of makeup brushed over fresh bruises. There were nights when she sang through split lips, the inside of her mouth stinging with every consonant. Nights when she spun and kicked and shimmied while her ribs ached so sharply that every breath felt like a question. The audience roared, completely unaware that the woman they were cheering for had spent the afternoon trying not to collapse in a quiet chair. The music industry, meanwhile, only tracked numbers, ticket sales, chart positions, television ratings. When executives visited, they shook Ike's hand first. They told him he had discovered a diamond. They praised his arrangements, his band, his vision. Some noticed Tina's stiffness in interviews, the way she chose her words carefully, the way her eyes sometimes drifted downward before she answered. But questions were a liability. Curiosity cost money. Silence preserved it. So the machine kept moving, and Tina remained locked inside it. Then came the night when the pressure finally broke the surface. In Los Angeles, after another cycle of violence and control, Tina checked into a hotel room that felt less like a place to rest and more like a holding cell. The city outside pulsed with neon and traffic, but the room itself was still, too still. The kind of stillness that makes every thought sound louder. On the desk, papers, a schedule for upcoming shows, a phone that promised nothing she wanted to hear. In the bathroom cabinet, a bottle of pills that promised silence. She stood at the mirror, looking at a face that millions would later recognize. But that night, she barely knew. The lashes, the wig, the dramatic stage makeup were gone. What was left was Anna Mae, tired, bruised, and carrying a burden that seemed to grow heavier every time someone shouted her name from a crowd. Ike had taught her that she was nothing without him. The industry had reinforced it. The contracts seemed to prove it. So she believed, for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, that removing herself might be the one decision she still controlled. She swallowed the pills, lay down, waited for the world to disappear. It did not. The attempt failed. Whether it was timing, intervention, or sheer stubborn fate, her body refused to comply with her plan. She woke to a reality that was exactly the same and completely different. Because once you try to leave life and it doesn't let you go, every second afterward becomes a question. What now? What for? If even death won't take me, what am I supposed to do? Back on tour, nothing seemed to change on the surface. The buses still rolled, the curtains still opened, the spotlights still burned. But inside her, a new fracture line had formed. It didn't break her yet. It just reminded her that breakage was possible. And then, in the middle of this relentless cycle, something unexpectedly small and quiet slipped into her life. A chant. One of the women around her accounts later pointed to members of her circle, people who saw her pain up close, introduced her to a new kind of ritual. No microphone, no band, no audience. Just words repeated softly, a pattern of sound that wasn't designed to entertain anyone. It was meant to hold her together. She sat on the floor, legs folded beneath her, and began to chant. At first it felt strange, almost absurd. She was used to sound as performance, as currency, as product. Here, the sound didn't go out to the world. It turned inward. The rhythm calmed her breathing. The repetition slowed the racing thoughts. The act of doing something purely for her own survival, not for a show, not for a contract, felt almost rebellious. She didn't instantly transform. She didn't suddenly become fearless. But she gained something that Ike had never intended for her to have. An inner room he could not enter. The more she chanted, the more that inner room expanded. It did not eliminate the violence, it did not erase the financial entanglements, the threats, the fear, but it gave her a thin, unshakable line, connecting her to a version of herself that wasn't defined by his rage. On stage, the change was invisible. The Ike and Tina Turner Revue still operated like a weapon. Tight choreography, relentless tempo, a show so powerful it left audiences gasping. But inside those performances, Tina began to carry a different intention. She wasn't just surviving the set, she was feeding something deep inside, a stubborn belief that she might exist beyond this man, beyond this band, beyond this trap. Ike sensed it. Controlling men always do. He tightened his grip. Arguments escalated over nothing. A missed cue became an offense. A private opinion became disrespect. Money was hidden. Decisions were made without her. He reminded her of the debts, the contracts, the mouths to feed. He framed himself as the architect and her as the replaceable part. Yet, night after night, she stood in front of thousands who proved the opposite. They didn't chant his name, they chanted hers. They didn't copy his movements, they copied hers. When they left those halls and arenas, it was her image they carried, her energy they tried to imitate, her voice echoing in their heads. The system didn't want to acknowledge that. Ike couldn't afford to. So the lie persisted. She needed him. As the 1,970 seconds dragged forward, cracks began to show in the facade that even the most dedicated silence couldn't hide. Ike's drug use deepened, his volatility sharpened, his absences grew longer. Sometimes he would vanish before a show, leaving everyone scrambling to keep the illusion afloat. Other times he would appear at the last moment, eyes restless, jaw clenched, rage close to the surface. The band learned to play around the danger. Tina learned to sing through it. But the inner room inside her continued to grow, and with it came a thought that wouldn't leave. If I was strong enough to try to leave life itself and survive, maybe I'm strong enough to leave him. The idea was terrifying. Ike had woven himself into every corner of her world. Professionally, financially, physically. Leaving wasn't just a breakup, it was a full-scale escape operation from a life she'd been told was the only one available to her. Still, the thought remained. Then it became a plan. Then the plan waited for a moment. That moment arrived one night in 1976 on the way to a show in Dallas. Another argument. Another explosion. Another reminder that staying meant slow erasure. By then, the woman who once believed her only exit was death had become someone else entirely bruised. Yes, scared, absolutely, but with a small, steady flame inside that refused to go out. The world saw costumes and choreography. It did not see that Tina Turner was about to commit the quietest, most dangerous act of rebellion in her entire life. She was going to walk away. Not from a man. From an entire system built on the assumption that she never would. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. The night in 1976 when everything finally snapped did not come with a warning label. It arrived the way most disasters do in abusive homes, disguised as just another argument. The Ike and Tina Turner Revue was on its way to a show in Dallas. Another city, another contract, another performance, where the crowd would scream for a couple that no longer existed anywhere except on stage. In the car, the air was thick with unspoken things. Ike's drug use, his paranoia, his temper, none of it was new. What was new was the level of danger she felt in her own bones. The fight started over something small. With Ike, it almost always did. A detail, a complaint, a perceived slight. Words sharpened, volume rose, and then the familiar shift happened, the one where the man in front of her vanished and the violence took his place. By the time they reached the hotel near the Dallas venue, the line had been crossed again. Inside the room, behind a door that might as well have been bolted from the outside, the rage broke open. His hands, his fists, his words, Tina had seen all of it before, but this time, something inside her refused to fold. The beating ended. The door remained. And Tina Turner made a choice. She waited. Timing was everything now. When Ike's energy finally burned itself out and he fell asleep, the room went quiet in a way that felt unnatural, almost staged. The TV flickered without sound. The city hummed outside. She looked down at herself. A white suit, stage-ready, now carrying marks that would never make it into a photograph. Her face swollen, lip bleeding, wig slightly shifted. She didn't change. She didn't pack. There was no suitcase by the door, no carefully folded clothes, no goodbye note. She slipped out of the room and into the hallway with one small bag, a mobile gas card, and 36 cents in her pocket. The hotel corridor was muffled, carpet swallowing her footsteps, air buzzing with the low hum of fluorescent lighting. Every door she passed felt like a test. Someone could step out. Ike could wake up. Security could ask questions. Any interruption could send her straight back into the life she was trying to escape. She reached the exit, pushed it open, and walked directly into the roar of the highway. Night traffic tore past in waves, headlights slicing through the dark, horns bleeding into each other. Standing at the edge of that road in a blood-stained white suit and high-heeled shoes, she looked less like a star and more like a ghost. She didn't wait for a proper crossing. There wasn't time for that. She gathered what strength she had left, stepped down off the curb, and ran. Cars swerved, tires screeched, horns exploded in panic and anger. Wind and heat slammed into her as she sprinted across lanes, shoes slapping the asphalt, heart pounding so loudly it seemed to drown out the world. For a few terrifying seconds, it felt like she was trapped in two deaths at once, the one she had just escaped and the one that might meet her in the middle of the road. But she made it. Stumbling, breathless, she reached the other side and found herself in the fluorescent safety of a Ramada Inn. Inside the lobby, the world was painfully ordinary. Beige carpets, plastic plants, a television in the corner murmuring some forgettable program. The receptionist looked up, expecting a tired traveler, not a world-famous performer in a ruined white suit. Tina approached the desk and did something she hadn't done in years. She asked for help as herself, not as half of a brand. She had almost no cash, just that gas card, those coins, and her name. The staff recognized her not as a victim, not as a prisoner, just as the woman they had seen on stage and on television. In that moment, their recognition became a lifeline. They gave her a room. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Tina Turner slept without Ike Turner in the next room, the next bed, the next breath. Freedom did not feel triumphant that night. It felt fragile, like something that could be taken back in an instant. In the days that followed, the escape turned into a case file. Lawyers were contacted, friends were alerted, the tour fell apart. Ike raged, threatened, insisted she would come back because that's what she had always done before. The industry watched from a distance, calculating. When she filed for divorce later that year in Los Angeles, the legal reality of their life together came into full, cold view. Contracts, assets, debts, royalties, houses, cars. The whole empire built on their names now had to be divided. That was where Tina made the decision that stunned even seasoned attorneys. She did not ask for the houses. She did not fight for the studios. She did not demand a share of the future earnings tied up in recordings with his name on them. She asked for one thing, her stage name. Tina Turner had been invented by Ike as a brand he could control. Keeping it meant carving her identity out of the very thing he thought he owned. It meant walking into the future with nothing but a name and the scars that came with it. When the divorce was finalized in 1978, she walked away with almost no money and a mountain of joint debt. To the industry's accountants, it looked like a terrible bargain. To her, it was the only deal that mattered. She had her life, her freedom, and the right to be herself in public without him attached. But the escape was only the first act. The rebuild would be brutal. The same business that had looked the other way while she was being broken behind closed doors did not line up to help her now. Some promoters assumed the draw had been Ike. Some executives quietly believed her time was over. She was a black woman in her late 30s, with a worn-out image and no controlling man fronting the negotiations. In their eyes, that was not an asset, it was a risk. So she did what survivors do when systems refused to make space for them. She took whatever space she could get. Vegas lounges, cabaret shows, hotel ballrooms, TV variety programs, and game shows that treated her like a nostalgia act rather than a force. She wore sequins, feathers, big hair, smiling for audiences that sometimes only half listened as they ate dinner or shuffled chips at casino tables. For someone who had once set arenas on fire, it could have felt like a humiliation. Instead, it became training. Every small stage was a lab. She experimented with rock covers, reshaped her arrangements, tested how far she could push her voice without a man controlling the set list. She learned how to speak for herself in interviews, how to negotiate, how to insist, in ways that would have been dangerous under Ike's shadow. The world she moved through now was not kind, but it was honest. If a show went badly, no one pretended otherwise. If a contract was unfair, there was no one to secretly sabotage it, but also no one to hide behind. Every mistake and every victory belonged to her. Then, quietly, the tide began to shift. In 1980, an Australian manager named Roger Davies saw something the industry had missed. Not a fading act, not a lounge fixture, a rock front woman trapped in the costume of a cabaret survivor. He pushed her toward a harder sound, bolder arrangements, stages where guitars screamed as loudly as her vocals. She opened for rock acts. She stepped into European venues where the audiences were younger, rougher, more willing to rewrite their idea of who she was. A demo here, a cover there. In 1983, her version of Let's Stay Together began to climb the charts overseas. It wasn't just a song, it was proof. Proof that her voice could still cut through a crowded landscape, that the world had not turned its back on her as completely as the gatekeepers believed. The momentum led to an album recorded largely in London Private Dancer, a project that sounded nothing like the old Ike and Tina review records. This wasn't a woman shouting over a band she didn't control. This was a 4-year-old survivor telling the world exactly how much it cost to keep going. When What's Love Got to Do With It hit #1 in 1984, the world called it a comeback. They loved the narrative. The woman who disappeared, now reborn. The industry packaged it like a miracle, a sudden rise from nowhere. But there had been no nowhere. There had been highways crossed in bloody white suits, cheap hotel rooms, divorce papers, lounge stages, and relentless, grinding work. There had been years of being ignored, doubted, underpaid, and underestimated. There had been a woman who once decided she didn't want to live, now standing in front of stadiums proving, night after night, that she was very much alive. The music business celebrated the success story because success was profitable. The same system that had overlooked her suffering now sold her survival. Tina Turner knew the difference. She knew exactly who had helped her climb back and who had benefited from her fall. Her greatest revenge was not a headline or a court case. It was the fact that, in the end, the name Ike Turner had tried to own became irrelevant to her legend. The world remembered Tina. Just Tina. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. By the time the world crowned her the Queen of Rock and Roll, Tina Turner's survival had already been turned into a commodity. Her pain was now a product. Her escape, an inspirational headline. In the mid-1980 seconds after Private Dancer exploded and What's Love Got to Do With It climbed to #1, the industry finally did what it should have done decades earlier. It centered her, but it didn't do it out of conscience. It did it because the numbers left no choice. She went from lounges and casinos to arenas and stadiums in a matter of months. World tours, magazine covers, talk shows. Under blinding lights, she looked invincible, legs flashing in short dresses, hair wild, voice tearing through rock arrangements that younger singers struggled to match. The crowd didn't see the scars. They didn't see the years of silence. They saw power. But even in victory, the ghost of the past stood just off stage. In 1993, Hollywood dramatized her story in a film that turned private horrors into box office and awards campaigns. Scenes of beatings, breakdowns, escape the most intimate, terror-filled moments of her life were now replayed in theaters, discussed by critics, consumed like entertainment. The movie gave millions their first real glimpse into what she had endured, and it gave the industry something else. Another way to profit from what had almost killed her. The public cried, gasped, applauded. And the same question hovered over all of it, unspoken. How many people had known enough to intervene, but never did? While the world dissected the dramatized version of her life, Tina moved in a different direction, away from the noise, away from Hollywood, away from the country where her suffering had been ignored and then marketed. She chose Switzerland. In the 1,990 seconds, she settled in a quiet home near Lake Zurich, far from the circuits that had once dictated her every move. The house did not scream celebrity. It was calm. Trees, water, clean light pouring through large windows. The kind of environment where footsteps could be heard long before anyone raised their voice, where nights ended in genuine silence instead of slammed doors. The man who shared that house with her was not a bandleader, not a producer, not a jealous architect of her career. He was Erwin Bach, a German music executive she had met years earlier. He was younger than her, which bothered outsiders more than it bothered her. What mattered was simple and radical. He did not try to control her. There are small details she later described: the way he carried groceries, the way he listened instead of correcting, the way he reached for her hand without checking whether anyone was watching. After a lifetime of being handled like property, these small things felt almost suspicious. Could it really be that simple? Could someone love her without trying to own her? Life in Küsnacht looked almost ordinary. Morning light on the lake. Chanting in a quiet room, beads in hand. No tour buses idling outside, no promoters pounding on doors. But nothing in Tina Turner's life was ever simple for long. The system she had escaped, abuse, control, financial exploitation, was not the only system she would end up fighting. Another one waited inside her own body. First came the stroke, sudden and brutal. One moment she was walking through her home, the next her body betrayed her. The woman who had once sprinted across stages in heels suddenly struggled to stand unassisted. Muscles that had carried her through thousands of shows refused basic commands. She had spent decades teaching herself how to move through danger. Now she had to relearn how to move through her own house. Then came the diagnosis of intestinal cancer. Harsh treatments, pain that had nothing to do with fists or shouted words, but that still dragged her back into familiar territory, the feeling of being trapped inside something she could not control. As if that weren't enough, her kidneys began to fail. The same body that had once seemed indestructible under stage lights was breaking piece by piece. Doctors explained the odds. Numbers, risks, timelines. It was the language of a different kind of industry, the medical one, but the power dynamics felt disturbingly similar. Her fate, once again, seemed to be calculated in rooms where she was not the loudest voice. Then Erwin stepped forward. He offered one of his kidneys. Not metaphorically, literally. He signed the papers. He lay down on a surgical table so that a part of his body could be placed into hers. The woman who had once been beaten for not doing what a man demanded was now staying alive because a man had voluntarily given her something he could never get back. They married in 2013 after decades together. Not at the beginning, when most couples do, but after time, illness, and survival had already tested them. The ceremony was elegant, controlled, almost understated. What mattered most was not the flowers or the guest list. It was the fact that, for the first time in her life, Tina Turner said "I do" in a situation where no had always been a real option. Yet, even as her private life finally found stability, new fractures appeared in places no surgeon could reach. In 2018, her oldest son, Craig, died by suicide. The boy she had carried through chaos, the child who had seen more violence than any child should, was gone. There are losses that do not fit into any interview, no matter how carefully the questions are asked. This was one of them. She spoke about it briefly, in carefully measured words. But the full weight of that grief never made it into headlines. What the world saw was a composed woman by a lake, a global icon reflecting on a long life. It did not see the nights when the water outside her window reflected back more absence than peace. In her final years, Tina Turner did something few survivors are allowed to do at her level of fame. She told her story in her own way, on her own timeline. Memoirs, documentaries, a stage musical bearing her name. Each project peeled back another layer of myth. She did not romanticize the abuse. She did not pretend forgiveness erased what had been done. She did not soften the truth, for the comfort of those who had looked away when it mattered. But she also refused to let her life be reduced to hurt. When she talked about music, her eyes still lit up. When she described standing in front of a stadium and hearing tens of thousands of strangers sing along to words she had once recorded alone in a booth, there was still awe in her voice. When she spoke about love hard-earned, late found, imperfect but real, there was something like peace. Still, there was a tension no amount of peace could fully dissolve. The question that haunted the edges of her story was not just, how did she survive? It was, why did it take the world so long to care? Who benefited from the years when she was silent? Her abuser, who built an empire around their combined name. The industry executives who made money off hits without asking what those hits cost. The audiences who clapped for chemistry without ever wondering about fear. Even in the end, when she lived in a quiet Swiss house with flowers on the table and photographs from decades of triumph lining the walls, the balance sheet of her life didn't add up cleanly. She had fame, money, love, and a measure of safety she had once believed impossible. But she had also paid with youth, with health, with family. When news of her passing finally spread across the world, tributes poured in. Clips of her wildest performances flooded screens. Commentators raised their voices, emphasizing words like legend, icon, survivor. For a few days, everyone seemed to agree on one thing: Tina Turner was extraordinary. But if you move past the montages and look at the file itself, the story is more unsettling than comforting. It is the story of a girl whose first lessons in love were abandonment, a young woman discovered not as a person, but as a useful voice, a wife beaten in rooms protected by contracts and silence, a survivor who ran across a highway with 36 cents and a gas card, a middle-aged performer clawing her way back from obscurity because no one in power cared enough to pull her up, an elder finally living in peace, still absorbing blows from life that no one could prevent. Tina Turner proved that a person can break free from a violent man. She also proved that escaping a man is not the same as escaping the systems that allow men like him to thrive. In the end, the question her life leaves behind is not just about her, it's about everyone who cheered, watched, bought tickets, signed contracts, printed headlines, and said nothing while she was breaking. Behind every legend, there is a ledger. Behind every triumphant comeback, there is a trail of cost that never makes it into the highlight reel. So the file closes on Tina Turner with one last uncomfortable question hanging in the air. In the next story like hers, and there will be a next one, who will choose to intervene before it becomes another legend, we only celebrate once it's too late? If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name